We will not let Iran drag this process for no reason, says the Secretary of State. What does it mean? I mean, the negotiations barely started on Monday. Were they over by Friday?
No, I can't suppress a little smile because Antony Blinken, who is not a novice in diplomacy, seems to be new to negotiating with Iranians. Iranians use time as a strategy in every negotiation they have had with the Western powers over the last 2 decades over the nuclear issue. And the strategy generally is, why make life easy for your counterparts if you can make it difficult? And especially in these circumstances, the current circumstances, where you have a new regime in Iran, nobody knew what exactly their stance would be, but everybody understood that there might be a possibility that they will come with very uncompromising and unacceptable positions as a starting point for negotiations, and that is precisely what has happened. So no, the negotiations will not stop on Friday. They will resume this week, in the coming week. I don't know for how long, but I don't see a real possibility that the negotiations will stop at such a short notice. I think the message that Antony Blinken is trying to convey is to the Iranians to say there is a limit to our patience for this well-known strategy of yours. And
we also mentioned that the chief of Mossad is traveling to Washington this week. Benny Gantz, defense minister, will do it. And maybe they're not very sad that the negotiations are failing because Israel was saying loud and clear, there's no point in negotiations because it will take you nowhere.
Yes. So the good news here is that there is a lot of transparency and a lot of coordination between Jerusalem and Washington, and that is a very, very important element for Israel. It's the only way that Israel can have some kind of influence on how the negotiations go, because Israel is not privy to these negotiations. So that's the good part. Now, the Israeli position is to say, listen, there's no point, don't negotiate. But there is no real other option that Israel is offering. There is the option of sanctions, but everybody knows that their effect is limited because there are countries that won't participate, and the Iranians always have the Chinese option of getting practically anything they need to circumvent these sanctions. So I'm not saying that the sanctions didn't hurt the Iranian economy, but they didn't render it unlivable in Iran. So that's the second point. My guess is, between the lines, is that the Israeli position openly, publicly, is to say to the Americans, listen, there's no point, just stop the negotiations, there's no point in trying to strive towards an agreement. Between the lines, I think that the main concern in Israel currently is the less for less option, the limited interim agreement, which in Jerusalem is considered to be really the worst of all options, because it will not put total limits on Iran's ability to move forward on the nuclear program, and it will not maintain the majority of sanctions, of pressure on Iran. So I think that is now the main concern that Mr. Barnea and Minister Gantz will try to convey in Washington.
You mentioned the fact that the Israeli position is one that has to be heard. Israel is not directly involved in the negotiations, right. but an interesting comment there coming from French President Emmanuel Macron about the fact that Israel's interests have to be heard. Let's listen.
Saudi Arabia has a legitimate concern for the possibility of Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon. I say it is a legitimate concern, and we share it because I think it is just not a concern for Iran's neighbors, but for the whole region and more broadly, the international community. I have said it. I have been saying it since 2017. I am among those who believe that we cannot deal with the nuclear issue without dealing with the issue of regional stability. And we can't move forward without involving in the discussion our friends in the region.
Israel has to be involved, says President Macron. He says it in Saudi Arabia because let's remember, Iran is not only an Israeli concern, an important message coming from the French president.
Yeah, so I think the context is important. He is touring the Gulf states. He was in the United Arab Emirates, he was in Qatar, and now he's in Saudi Arabia. And clearly the Iranian nuclear threat is very present in every discussion that you have with these countries. So I think the context for this statement is important, but the fact that he included Israel as part of the regional concerns, and he could do this, in one sentence, joining Israel and Gulf states together, is also a sign of new collaborations and new common interests in this region between Israel and some of the Arab countries here.
Interesting comments there coming. Ambassador Daniel Sheikh, thank you very much for being with us.
Headliner, Mossad chief Benny Gantz in D.C. to urge tougher stance on Iran, dated December 8, 2021. Mossad head David Barnea and Defense Minister Benny Gantz took rearguard action in Washington to try to change the West's approach to negotiations with Iran as they were set to resume in Vienna on Thursday. Both are speaking with one message, same as the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister. Iran is susceptible to pressure. Don't lift sanctions and don't go with a bad deal, a senior Israeli diplomatic source told Jerusalem Post. We're dealing with the huge motivation of Western powers to return to a deal, but the top echelon in Israel is having its say at full force. That's very important, the source said. Gantz, who headed to Washington on Wednesday night, is expected to warn the Americans that Iran's advances are bringing it to the nuclear threshold. And the way to attain a better deal is to put as much pressure as possible on the regime. The defense minister will ask Washington to seek an agreement that also addresses Iran's regional aggression with ballistic missiles. State Department spokesman Ted Price said alternatives to continuing negotiations with Iran will be a topic of discussion with Gantz. Price later said, I fully expect regional security issues to be discussed, including what we're seeing with Iran, and, as we said before, the alternatives that might be forced to pursue if Iran shows to our allies and partners that it's not willing to return in a substantive and genuine constructive way to Vienna. Barnea presented up-to-date intelligence to senior American figures this week pertaining to Iran's nuclear advances and its international terror campaign. Last week, Barnea said Iran will never have a nuclear weapon, not in the coming years, never. That is my commitment and the Mossad's commitment. He also said, clearly there is no need for uranium enrichment to 60% for civilian purposes. There is no need for 3 sites with thousands of centrifuges unless the intention is to develop a nuclear weapon, he said at an award ceremony for Mossad agents. Our eyes are open. We are prepared, and we will do all that is needed to remove the threat from the state of Israel and thwart it in every way. Iran and world powers are expected to return to negotiations to revive the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which limited Tehran's uranium enrichment until 2030 in exchange for the gradual lifting of sanctions. The U.S. left the deal in 2018 and now seeks to return, along with a return to compliance by Iran. Iran, however, has advanced its nuclear program far beyond the JCPOA's 5% uranium enrichment restriction to 60% enrichment, which has no credible civilian use. The level of enrichment needed for a nuclear weapon is 90%. Those advances have brought in the Biden administration to seek an interim deal in which Tehran would freeze, but not scale back, its uranium enrichment in exchange for the U.S. lifting some sanctions set after 2018. However, during last week's 7th round of negotiations this year, and the first since June, the Islamic Republic started enriching uranium to 20% purity with advanced centrifuges at its Fordow site, which is buried inside a mountain. That and uncompromising Iranian draft agreements brought the U.S. and E3, Britain, France, and Germany, to stop talks last week, but they are set to continue on Thursday. British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss said Thursday that talks are really the last chance for Iran to sign up to return to the JCPOA. She went on to say, I strongly urge them to do that because we are determined to work with our allies to prevent Iran securing nuclear weapons. So they do need to sign up to the JCPOA agreement. It's in their best interest to do so. U.S. envoy for Iran, Robert Malley, the lead U.S. negotiator in Vienna, spoke with the deputy foreign ministers of Russia and China on Wednesday and said they will continue close trilateral coordination to achieve our common goal of mutual full JCPOA compliance based on the progress made over the first 6 rounds. The senior diplomatic source in Jerusalem expressed frustration at how soon the Western powers returned to the table, saying it shows their eagerness to reach an agreement fast. The source went on to say the Iranians respond to pressure. After they submitted 2 audacious drafts and were told they're crazy, Iran folded and wanted to return fast. The Iranians called the Western states and they came. The rial has collapsed and there are protests around Iran. The West has all the cards that allow it to be tough. They should play them, the source added. Headliner: Israel to launch major exercise this spring simulating strike on Iran. Dated December 8, 2021. The Israeli Defense Forces will hold a large-scale exercise over the Mediterranean in the spring with dozens of aircraft simulating a strike against Iran's nuclear program, the military confirmed Thursday. The plan comes as Israel officials have stepped up their rhetoric against the Islamic Republic, including threatening to take unilateral action against Tehran. According to a Wednesday report by the Khan public broadcaster, which was confirmed by the IDF the following morning, the drill will be one of the largest held ever by the Israeli Air Force. It will include dozens of aircraft, including the F-15, F-35, and F-16 fighters, Gulfstream 550 spy planes, and refueling jets. The planes will conduct the exercise far out over the Mediterranean Sea to simulate the distance over 1,000 kilometers, that's 620 miles for you Americans, that the aircraft would need to travel in a strike against Iran's nuclear facilities. This would not be the first time that the IAF has conducted exercises at these distances. Earlier this year, Israeli jets took part in a Greek-led exercise over the Mediterranean Sea. The exercise is scheduled to be held in roughly 6 months. Talks between Iran and world powers over curbing Tehran's nuclear program resumed last week after an extended freeze, though Israeli politicians have said they would support a significantly bolstered part. They have also stressed the need for a credible military threat against Iran as a plan B. In January, Army Chief Aviv Kohavi announced that he was instructing the military to draw up fresh plans for a strike against Iran's nuclear program. The IDF received billions of shekels of additional funding to prepare for such an attack as part of the recently passed national budget. Last month, Kohavi told the Knesset's Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee that the Army is accelerating operational planning and preparedness to deal with Iran and the military nuclear threat. Though Israeli officials have stressed that Israel could carry out a strike without coordinating with the United States. Some analysts have cast doubts on the IDF's ability to do so, as several Iranian facilities are buried deep enough underground that it would require particularly powerful munitions, which currently only the U.S. possesses. Reports in recent weeks have indicated the Army is unprepared for dealing with Iran, months or so away from an actionable plan. That is the latest news, and now my thoughts. As you can see, Israel seemed to be instigating the incident, trying to pressure the United States from having these talks in Vienna, because Israel is not privy to them. They will not show up because they don't want peace. The Israeli government doesn't want peace with Iran. Did they want peace in Iraq? We saw how that went. How about Libya? Lebanon? Syria? We saw the effects of peace talks and sanctions. Iran is the only one that's standing. Syria is barely standing, and that's because of the Russians and Iranians and the Hezbollah proxy forces came and defeated the Gulf and Western-backed Syrian jihadists. But the Iranian-Israeli conflict has been going back decades. Now, I'm not going to take you through a history lesson, but ever since the Syrian Arab Spring, the conflict between Israel and the Shiites have been exceptionally exceeding in terms of violence. And of course, the control of the Golan Heights. During the Syrian civil war, they were hoping to bolster its logistics and force projection capabilities in the area. But Tehran aims to clear a path from the Iranian capital to Damascus and the Mediterranean coast. Now, the Israeli government is convinced that Iran was interested in creating territorial continuity between Iran and the Mediterranean and combining forces with Lebanon's Hezbollah and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, making them quite a powerful entity in the region. Heaven forbid, Israel has a powerful entity behind them, and that's the United States coalition. If the Arabs want to defend themselves, why can't they? If Iran wants to build nuclear weapons, why can't they? Israel has them, and they won't allow any type of vetting or independent nuclear committee to find out how many weapons they have. And when a whistleblower named Mordecai Vanunu tried to blow the whistle, he was found guilty and sentenced to 18 years. Hypocrites. It is estimated anywhere between 80 to 400 nuclear warheads that Israel has. So the reason why Iran is not allowed to build any enrichment uranium for their own protection is that Israel developed the Begin Doctrine, counter-proliferation and preemptive strikes, which are denying other regional actors the ability to acquire their own nuclear weapons. In 1981, they conducted Operation Opera, which was a surprise air attack conducted by the Israeli Air Force, or the IAF, which destroyed unfinished Iraqi nuclear facilities in Baghdad. And Operation Orchid, which was an Israeli airstrike on a suspected nuclear reactor in the Al-Kibar site in Syria in September of 2007. And then you had the famous Stuxnet malware that damaged Iranian nuclear facilities in 2010, in which the Israeli security services developed a malware to destroy or to compromise Israeli computers. And as of the current moment, Israel is the only country in the Middle East believed to possess nuclear weapons. And they started building nuclear weapons as soon as it declared independence in 1948. Even though the United States was concerned over possible Israeli nuclear proliferation, in which John F. Kennedy in 1961 put continuous pressure on Israel to open the plant to American inspection. And to increase that pressure, Kennedy denied David Ben-Gurion a meeting at the White House. When they met in 1961, and it was at the Waldorf Astoria here in New York City. When they reconvened, Ben-Gurion was quite passive and evasive on the issue for years, 2 years, for an inspection. And then I think it was Kennedy made a letter on May 18, 1963, which threatened Israel with total isolation unless inspectors were allowed into the Dimona facility. And then Ben-Gurion resigned, prime minister, shortly after. But we saw what happened to Kennedy. On November 22nd, 1963. With Israel and Iran, you had a number of incidents. Now, I'm not going to go into it because there are literally over 100. But just in Syria, just this year alone, April 10th, 2021, Iran began injecting uranium hexafluoride gas into advanced IR-6 and IR-5 centrifuges, but an accident occurred in the electricity distribution network in the next day due to Mossad activity, according to Western sources. On April 24th, an Iranian fuel tanker was attacked off the Syrian coast by an Israeli drone. On May 7th, a massive fire broke out in Iran's southwestern city of Bushehr, near the only functioning nuclear power plant of the country. The fire was intentional and the cause was unknown. On May 9th, an explosion occurred at an oil tanker off the coast of Syria, causing a small fire in one of its engines. The blast occurred after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, said a drone armed with explosives that was downed by Israeli forces early in the week was launched by Iran toward Israel from either Syria or Iraq. That claim was unfounded. On May 26th, an explosion took place at a petrochemical complex in the city of Asalea in southern Iran, killing a worker and injuring two. On June 2nd, a fire broke out in an Iranian Navy vessel, the IRS Karg, near the port of Jask in the Gulf of Oman, although the entire crew was able to safely disembark before the ship sank. Later in the day, there was a gas leak at an oil refinery in Tehran, which caused a massive fire. An explosion took place in the Zaran Iranian Steel Company in eastern Iran on June 5th. And on June 20th, it was reported that Iran's sole nuclear power plant at the Bushehr underwent an emergency shutdown. On July 3rd, an Israeli-owned cargo ship was struck by an unknown weapon. On July 5th, a large fire was reported at a warehouse or a factory near the city of Karaj, where an alleged previous attack targeted a nuclear facility used to produce centrifuges. On July 29th, an Israeli-operated oil tanker was attacked near the coast of Oman, and according to senior Israeli officials, the attack was conducted by Iran, but there was no Iranian attack, according to Western sources. On August 10th, a major explosion took place on a commercial ship docked at Lakia port in Syria, and some reports identified the target ship as Iranian. On October 26th, a cyber attack crippled gas stations across Iran. It was reported that some hacked systems displayed messages addressing Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, demanding to know where is the gas. And on November 7th, it was reported that the Mossad thwarted multiple Iranian attacks on Israelis in Ghana, Tanzania, and Senegal. Iran has also attempted to strike Israeli overseas using cyber attacks. And on November 17th, Iranian media reported an explosion at an oil pipeline south of the country. Now, this is all basically Israeli Mossad, Israeli security services trying to precipitate and disrupt the country from procuring uranium enrichment and their oil and gas reserves in the country. It's how you cripple a country from within, using false flag attacks. And I think these are acts of war. And Iran has shown rather stoic defense. Any other country would have reacted in an appropriate manner. But Iran doesn't want war. If they did, a number of these incidents would have provoked it. And I just read you about 15 of them just this year. I didn't even read 2020, 2019, 2018. I could go back 20 years. The Israeli nuclear facilities have grown since 1948. Now, I don't know if Iran is building a nuclear bomb or not, but even if they did, it would be suicide on their part, complete and total suicide, if they used it against Israel or any Western interest in the region, whether it be Saudi Arabia or the Gulf. So it would make zero sense for them to use that weapon as an act of aggression, knowing that the United States is waiting in the wings, desperate, and surrounding them with military U.S.-based stations. Knowing that the coalition led by the Gulf and Israel would attack to destroy the country from within. And the world stage would forever know Iran as the aggressor. This is what the security services, the intelligence services want. They want to portray Iran as the agitator. But if one takes a look at history, if one could just look at history without any prejudicial or biased mindset, the aggressors have always been the United States, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, and Israel.